In the shadow of Appalachia's rolling mountains, a story lies hidden in the double helix of time, a genetic narrative that challenges everything we thought we knew about American identity. The year was 1998 when Benjamin Calloway first noticed the anomaly in his lab results. The genetic markers didn't align with established models of Native American DNA. He recalibrated his equipment, ran the tests again, and stared at the screen in disbelief. The samples from Eastern Band Cherokee descendants showed genetic signatures that, according to prevailing science, shouldn't exist in indigenous North American populations. "This can't be right," he whispered to his empty laboratory, the fluorescent lights humming above him like an electrical conscience. But it was right. And what began as a routine study would evolve into one of the most controversial genetic investigations in modern anthropology, revealing not only scientific truths but the human cost of our national mythology. What if everything you learned about Native American origins was fundamentally incomplete? What if, encoded in the DNA of one of America's most historically significant tribes, lay evidence that would rewrite not just their story, but America's? This is not merely a tale of genetics. It is a journey through time, identity, and the uncomfortable truths that scientific discovery sometimes forces us to confront. The story of the Cherokee people has always been told through the lens of European contact, forced relocation, and cultural assimilation. But beneath that narrative, literally within the cells of their descendants, another story has been waiting to be read. A story written in nucleotides rather than words, in genetic inheritance rather than oral tradition. A story that, once revealed, would challenge the foundations of American anthropology and force us to reconsider what it means to be native to this continent. Dr. Calloway could not have predicted how his discovery would ripple through scientific communities, indigenous nations, and eventually the American consciousness itself. But as we unravel this genetic mystery, we will see that DNA, like history, is never as straightforward as we might hope. The question that would haunt Benjamin Calloway for the next 2 decades was simple yet profound. How could a genetic signature associated with ancient Eurasian populations appear in Cherokee DNA samples that predated European contact? The answer would prove far more complex than the question itself, leading us down pathways of science, history, and human migration that few had dared to explore. To understand the magnitude of what was discovered, we need to step back and examine the established narrative of how humans first arrived in the Americas. For decades, the scientific consensus had been relatively straightforward. Approximately 15,000 to 20,000 years ago, during the last ice age, people from Northeast Asia crossed the Bering Land Bridge, a now-submerged landmass that once connected Siberia to Alaska. These first Americans, according to the theory, were the ancestors of all indigenous populations in North and South America. This Beringian standstill model proposed that the ancestors of Native Americans remained isolated in Beringia for thousands of years before migrating into North America as the ice sheets receded. This isolation, scientists believed, explained the genetic uniqueness of indigenous American populations. It was clean, elegant, and supported by both archaeological evidence and early genetic studies. But science, at its best, is a self-correcting endeavor. And by the late 1990s, as genetic sequencing technology advanced, researchers began finding complications in this neat narrative. Dr. Emma Grayson, a paleoanthropologist from the University of Arizona, was one of the first to publicly challenge the simplicity of the single migration model. Human migration is rarely a one-time, one-direction event, she explained during a contentious 2001 conference presentation. Throughout history, humans have been explorers, moving back and forth across landscapes, interbreeding, separating, and reconnecting over thousands of years. The idea that the Americas remained completely isolated until European contact in 1492 is not just scientifically questionable. It reflects our modern political boundaries more than ancient human behavior. Her words were prophetic. The following year, an international team published findings showing at least 3 distinct genetic lineages among Native American populations, suggesting multiple waves of migration rather than a single founding population. But even this more complex model maintained the core assumption that all migrations came from Northeast Asia via Beringia. What Benjamin Calloway found in his Cherokee DNA samples threatened to upend even this revised understanding. The genetic markers he identified, specifically certain haplotypes in mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome sequences, showed similarities to ancient DNA samples from Southern Europe and the Near East. These weren't markers that could be explained by post-Columbian admixture with European colonizers. Carbon-dated remains containing these genetic signatures predated European arrival by centuries. "I thought I had made a mistake," Calloway later wrote in his journal. "I spent 3 months double-checking everything, sending samples to independent labs, before I was willing to even consider what this might mean." What it might mean was explosive. Either there had been pre-Columbian contact between Eastern Native American populations and peoples from across the Atlantic, a theory that mainstream archaeology had long dismissed as fringe, or the story of human migration into the Americas was far more complex than anyone had imagined. The initial reaction from the scientific community was skepticism bordering on hostility. Dr. Martin Reeves of the Smithsonian Institution dismissed Calloway's findings as contamination, misidentification, or misinterpretation, possibly all three. Others were less diplomatic, suggesting that Calloway was engaging in pseudoscience that would only empower white supremacist groups seeking to undermine Native American sovereignty claims. This last criticism stung Calloway deeply. As a scientist with Cherokee ancestry himself, his great-grandmother was a member of the Eastern Band. He was acutely aware of the potential political implications of his research. "Science does not exist in a vacuum," he acknowledged in a 2003 interview. "Genetic data has been misused throughout history to justify terrible things. But we cannot let fear of misuse prevent us from pursuing truth. The Cherokee people, like all people, deserve to know their full history, not just the parts that fit neatly into current political narratives." The controversy might have remained confined to academic journals had it not been for the involvement of Eliza Grayhawk, a Cherokee Nation citizen and molecular biologist who had been independently investigating anomalies in indigenous genetic samples. When she encountered Calloway's published research in 2004, she immediately recognized its significance and reached out to collaborate. "Benjamin's data aligned with patterns I had been seeing in my own work," Grayhawk explained years later. "But where he was focused on the genetic signatures themselves, I was interested in their distribution throughout Cherokee communities and their correlation with traditional knowledge about tribal origins." This partnership would prove crucial in the coming years, as the research moved beyond genetic analysis to incorporate linguistic evidence, archaeological findings, and, most controversially, Cherokee oral traditions that had been largely dismissed by Western academics. What emerged was not a simple revision of existing theories, but something far more profound. Evidence that the peopling of the Americas was a complex, multi-directional process spanning thousands of years and involving populations from multiple continents. The implications would reach far beyond academia, challenging fundamental aspects of American identity and forcing a reconsideration of what words like native and indigenous truly mean in a human story defined by migration, adaptation, and the eternal search for new horizons. As Calloway and Grayhawk delved deeper into their research, the mystery only intensified. The genetic markers they were tracking appeared in approximately 8 to 12% of Cherokee DNA samples from the Eastern Band, but were almost entirely absent in Cherokee populations from Oklahoma, whose ancestors had been forcibly relocated during the Trail of Tears in the 1830s. This geographic distribution raised new questions. Why would these genetic signatures be concentrated in the Appalachian region? What historical or environmental factors might explain this pattern? And most intriguingly, did this distribution correlate with any cultural or linguistic differences between Eastern and Western Cherokee communities? To pursue these questions, the researchers expanded their team to include Dr. Thomas Reed, a linguistic anthropologist specializing in Iroquoian languages, the language family to which Cherokee belongs. Reed had spent decades studying the peculiarities of Cherokee language, which linguistic scholars had long recognized as an outlier within the Iroquoian family. Cherokee has several phonological and grammatical features that distinguish it from other Iroquoian languages, Reed explained. Some of these features have puzzled linguists for generations because they seem to have developed in isolation from external influences. But when you compare certain Cherokee linguistic structures to ancient Mediterranean and Middle Eastern languages, some intriguing parallels emerge. Reed was careful not to overstate these similarities. We're not talking about direct linguistic borrowing or mutual intelligibility, he emphasized. Rather, we see structural patterns that suggest possible ancient contact or shared ancestry far more distant than previously considered. The team also brought in Dr. Sofia Martinez, an archaeologist who had been documenting unusual artifacts from pre-Columbian sites in the southern Appalachians. Martinez had found objects that didn't fit neatly into known Native American material cultures. Stonework with distinctive patterns similar to ancient Mediterranean styles, unusual metallurgical techniques, and burial practices that differed from surrounding indigenous cultures. For years, these anomalies were either ignored or attributed to contamination from later European settlements, Martinez said. But when you carbon date these artifacts and place them in stratigraphic context, it becomes clear that some predate European contact by hundreds of years. Perhaps most controversial was the team's decision to take seriously certain Cherokee oral traditions that had been historically dismissed by Western academics as myths or post-contact inventions. Many Cherokee stories speak of ancient ancestors who came from across the Great Water and of encounters with light-skinned, bearded visitors long before European colonization. Eliza Greyhawk approached these traditions with both respect and scientific rigor. Indigenous oral histories have often proven remarkably accurate when verified against archaeological and genetic evidence, she noted. These are not simply stories. They're sophisticated knowledge transmission systems that have preserved information across countless generations. One particular Cherokee origin story described an ancient migration from a distant land following a catastrophic event, led by a figure called the Pale One. This narrative had been documented by missionaries in the 18th century but dismissed as a post-contact adaptation of biblical stories. However, linguistic analysis of the original Cherokee text revealed archaic language forms and concepts that predated Christian influence in the region. As the team compiled this multidisciplinary evidence, a hypothesis began to take shape. Sometime between 500 and 1000 CE, a small group of seafarers from the Eastern Mediterranean or North Africa may have reached the Atlantic coast of North America. Rather than establishing colonies or conquering territories, these travelers appear to have integrated into existing indigenous communities, particularly in the Appalachian region, contributing to the genetic and cultural diversity of populations that would later be identified as Cherokee. This hypothesis was met with immediate backlash. Critics accused the team of promoting diffusionist theories that historically had been used to deny indigenous people agency and achievement. Others warned that such research could undermine tribal sovereignty by questioning the native status of indigenous peoples. Dr. James Wilson, a prominent archaeologist from Harvard University, publicly condemned the research as archaeologically unsupportable and politically dangerous. In a scathing review published in American Anthropologist, he wrote, "Claims of pre-Columbian transatlantic contact have a long, inglorious history of being weaponized against Native American communities. While cloaked in the language of objective science, such theories inevitably feed into narratives that diminish indigenous achievement and undermine legitimate sovereignty claims." The political dimensions of the controversy intensified when several white nationalist groups began citing the research, often misrepresenting its actual findings, to support their own ideological agendas. This development devastated Calloway and Greyhawk, who had been meticulous in framing their research as an expansion of indigenous history rather than a replacement or diminishment. "Our work has been grotesquely distorted," Calloway stated in a press release responding to the misappropriation. "We are not suggesting that Cherokee culture or identity is European, or that indigenous peoples are not the original inhabitants of this continent. We are simply providing evidence that human history is more complex and interconnected than previously recognized, a fact that in no way diminishes Native American claims to their ancestral lands or cultural heritage." Despite these clarifications, the controversy continued to grow. Academic institutions began distancing themselves from the research. Funding dried up. Calloway and Greyhawk found themselves increasingly isolated within their professional communities. But as external support waned, something unexpected happened. Members of the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians began reaching out to the researchers, offering to participate in the study and sharing family histories that seemed to corroborate aspects of their findings. Mary Wolfe, an 87-year-old Cherokee elder from the Qualla boundary, the Eastern Cherokee Reservation in North Carolina, contacted Greyhawk after reading about the research. "My grandmother told me stories about our family coming from across the water long ago," she said. "I always thought these were just old tales, maybe mixed up with things from after the white people came. But when I saw your research, something clicked. These weren't confused stories, they were memories." Other community members came forward with similar accounts, physical artifacts preserved through generations, and distinctive family traits that had been noticed but never scientifically examined. The research was transforming from an academic inquiry into a community-driven exploration of identity and history. This shift marked a turning point in the project's trajectory. Rather than pursuing publication in mainstream scientific journals, Calloway and Greyhawk began working directly with Cherokee communities, establishing a participatory research model where tribal members were not merely subjects of study but active collaborators in the investigation of their own genetic heritage. This approach yielded new insights that conventional scientific methods might have missed. Cherokee participants identified specific families and clans where the unusual genetic markers seemed most concentrated. They pointed researchers toward particular geographic locations with unusual archaeological features. They shared linguistic knowledge passed down through generations, words, phrases, and concepts that didn't fit neatly into cataloged Cherokee language but carried echoes of distant Mediterranean tongues. What had begun as a genetic anomaly detected in a laboratory was evolving into something far richer. A multidimensional exploration of human connection across time and space, conducted not just with scientific instruments but through the living knowledge of a people who had maintained their identity despite centuries of displacement and oppression. As one community participant expressed it, "This isn't about being part European or questioning who we are as Cherokee. It's about reclaiming the fullness of our history. All the journeys, encounters, and adaptations that made us who we are today. For too long, others have told us who we are and where we come from. Now we're using both science and traditional knowledge to tell our own story." This collaborative approach would ultimately produce findings far more nuanced and profound than the original genetic discovery. But it would also lead the researchers toward controversial territory that few had anticipated: the enigmatic world of epigenetics and the possibility that historical trauma might leave genetic traces across generations, connecting the biological and historical in ways that modern science was only beginning to comprehend. As the research collaboration between scientists and Cherokee community members deepened, the team began to notice patterns that couldn't be explained by genetics alone. Families carrying the unusual genetic markers reported not just physical traits but distinctive psychological characteristics: unusual sensitivities to certain environmental stimuli, recurring dream patterns, and specific phobias that seemed to run through generations. Dr. Rachel Donnelly, a neuropsychologist who joined the team in 2008, was initially skeptical of these anecdotal reports. "The scientific community has rightly been cautious about claims linking complex psychological traits to genetic ancestry," she noted. "Such associations have an ugly history in eugenics and scientific racism." But what we were seeing didn't fit those paradigms. These weren't claims about racial characteristics but highly specific traits clustered within particular family lineages. Donnelly designed a rigorous blind study to test whether these psychological patterns could be objectively verified. The results were striking. Individuals carrying the distinctive genetic markers showed statistically significant differences in sensory processing, stress responses, and certain cognitive tasks compared to genetic relatives without those markers. These findings led the team toward the emerging field of epigenetics, the study of how environmental factors can affect how genes are expressed without changing the underlying DNA sequence. Epigenetic changes occur when molecules attach to DNA and modify its function, turning certain genes on or off in response to environmental conditions. Crucially, some of these modifications can be inherited by subsequent generations. What we may be seeing, Calloway hypothesized, is not just the inheritance of ancient DNA sequences but the epigenetic traces of historical experiences, a biological memory, if you will, of ancestral traumas and adaptations. This hypothesis ventured into contentious scientific territory. While epigenetic inheritance had been well documented in plants and some animals, its role in human transgenerational effects remained controversial. Yet several groundbreaking studies had provided compelling evidence that extreme environmental stresses, such as famine or severe trauma, could indeed leave epigenetic marks that influenced subsequent generations. A 2008 study of Holocaust survivors and their children had found distinctive epigenetic patterns associated with PTSD that appeared to be transmitted to offspring who had never experienced the original trauma. Similar findings had emerged from studies of descendants of famine survivors and indigenous communities subjected to colonial violence. Applying these frameworks to their Cherokee research, Calloway and Greyhawk proposed that the unusual genetic signatures they'd identified might carry epigenetic modifications reflecting both the traumatic oceanic journey of ancient Mediterranean travelers and their subsequent integration into indigenous North American communities. "This isn't just about who came from where," Greyhawk explained. "It's about how those journeys, whether across the Bering Strait 15,000 years ago or across the Atlantic 1,500 years ago, literally shaped the biology of descendants in ways that transcend simple genetic inheritance." This perspective offered a new framework for understanding historical trauma, not just as cultural memory or psychological impact, but as biological inheritance written into the very expression of our genes. For Cherokee participants in the study, this resonated deeply with traditional understandings of intergenerational connection. "Our elders have always told us that we carry our ancestors within us," explained Joseph Running Wolf, a Cherokee spiritual leader who advised the research team. "Western science is only now beginning to understand what indigenous knowledge systems have recognized for thousands of years, that experiences of our forebears shape who we are in ways that go beyond the stories we're told or the cultural practices we inherit." The implications extended far beyond the specific case of Cherokee genetics. If historical experiences could indeed leave epigenetic traces across generations, then the biological impact of events like colonization, slavery, forced relocation, and cultural genocide might be more profound and long-lasting than previously recognized by Western science. This framework also offered a new perspective on questions of cultural resilience and adaptation. The Eastern Band of Cherokee had survived the devastating impact of European contact, including population collapse from disease, warfare, land theft, and the forced removal of many community members during the Trail of Tears. Yet they had maintained cultural continuity and a distinct identity despite these enormous pressures. Perhaps, the researchers suggested, this resilience reflected not just cultural adaptation but biological responsiveness, epigenetic mechanisms that allowed communities to retain essential knowledge and adaptive traits even through catastrophic disruption. "We're not talking about genetic determinism," Calloway emphasized. "Human beings are not simply the product of their DNA or even their epigenetics. But understanding these biological dimensions of historical experience helps us recognize the profound interconnection between cultural and biological inheritance, between the stories we tell and the molecular processes occurring within our cells." This perspective offered a bridge between Western scientific paradigms and indigenous knowledge systems that had long recognized these connections. It suggested that ancient wisdom about ancestral presence and intergenerational responsibility might contain insights that modern genetics was only beginning to comprehend. As this research progressed, the team encountered yet another layer of complexity. The distinctive genetic markers they had identified weren't evenly distributed throughout the Eastern Cherokee population. They showed striking correlations with certain traditional roles within the community. Specifically, these markers appeared with significantly higher frequency among families traditionally associated with healing practices, spiritual leadership, and astronomical knowledge. This pattern raised fascinating questions. Could ancient genetic admixture have influenced the development of specific cultural traditions? Or conversely, did cultural practices create selection pressures that maintained certain genetic lineages? To explore these questions, the team turned to a remarkable resource that had been largely overlooked by previous researchers: the extensive ethnographic records compiled by James Mooney, a Bureau of American Ethnography anthropologist who lived among the Eastern Cherokee in the late 19th century. Mooney had documented detailed information about traditional medical practices, ceremonial knowledge, and family lineages that maintained specific cultural roles. Cross-referencing Mooney's records with their genetic data, the researchers found startling correlations. Families that Mooney had identified as maintaining traditional healing knowledge in the 1890s showed significantly higher frequencies of the Mediterranean-linked genetic markers in contemporary testing. This pattern suggests a possible connection between ancient genetic admixture and the development of particular cultural specializations, noted Dr. William Thompson, an anthropological geneticist who joined the research team in 2010. It's as if these genetic lineages became associated with specific knowledge systems and were maintained through cultural practices that encouraged certain family lines to specialize in particular roles. This finding challenged simplistic models of both genetic determinism and cultural constructionism. It suggested instead a complex coevolution of genetic inheritance and cultural practice, a dynamic interplay where biological and cultural factors influenced each other over many generations. For the Cherokee participants in the study, these findings resonated with traditional understandings of how knowledge and special abilities are transmitted. In our traditions, certain gifts run in families, explained Margaret Swimmer, a traditional healer whose genetic testing revealed significant levels of the Mediterranean markers. This isn't just about teaching and learning, though that's important too. It's about carrying a certain spirit, a certain way of seeing and being in the world that comes through your bloodline. This perspective invited reconsideration of how traditional indigenous knowledge systems develop and persist. Rather than viewing them as purely cultural constructions, the research suggested they might emerge from complex interactions between environmental adaptation, cultural innovation, and biological inheritance, including both genetic and epigenetic factors. The team also began investigating potential connections between the unusual genetic markers and specific aspects of Cherokee traditional medicine. Certain plant medicines used by Cherokee healers for centuries contain compounds that interact with neurological and immunological pathways in ways that might be particularly effective for individuals with specific genetic profiles. We're seeing preliminary evidence that some traditional Cherokee treatments may be particularly effective for people carrying these specific genetic signatures, Calloway noted. This raises the fascinating possibility that ancient healing traditions evolved not just through trial and error, but through an intuitive recognition of how certain remedies affected people with particular ancestries. This finding aligned with emerging research in pharmacogenomics, the study of how genetic variation influences individual responses to medications. Modern medical research had begun recognizing that drug efficacy often varies significantly between patients of different ancestral backgrounds. Traditional healing systems, having evolved over thousands of years of careful observation, may have incorporated this understanding long before Western science developed the tools to explain it. The implications were profound not just for understanding Cherokee history, but for recognizing the sophisticated empirical foundations of indigenous knowledge systems more broadly. These weren't simply cultural beliefs, but complex intellectual traditions grounded in generations of careful observation and testing, traditions that had incorporated understanding of human diversity, including the diversity introduced through ancient population movements and admixture. As this research developed, it attracted attention from indigenous scholars and community members from other Native American nations. Many recognized parallels with anomalies in their own genetic studies and oral traditions that had previously been dismissed or explained away. Dr. Robert Two Bears, a Lakota geneticist from South Dakota, reached out to Calloway after reading about the Cherokee findings. "We've been seeing similar genetic patterns in some Lakota families," he shared. "There's always been this assumption that anything anomalous in Native American genetics must be the result of post-contact European admixture. But that explanation never fully accounted for the distribution patterns we were observing or the oral histories in our communities." Similar reports began coming from indigenous researchers working with Maya communities in Guatemala, Mi'kmaq populations in eastern Canada, and Pueblo groups in the southwestern United States. Each described genetic signatures that didn't fit the standard model of Native American origins, along with oral traditions suggesting ancient contact with peoples from across the oceans. What had begun as an investigation into Cherokee genetics was expanding into a continental reassessment of indigenous American history, one that recognized greater complexity, connectedness, and dynamism than previous models had allowed. Far from diminishing Native American achievement or sovereignty, this emerging picture highlighted the sophisticated ways in which indigenous communities had integrated diverse influences while maintaining distinctive cultural identities over thousands of years. This perspective challenged the artificial separation between Old World and New World histories, a division that reflected European colonial perspectives rather than indigenous understandings of human movement and connection. It suggested instead a human story characterized by continuous exploration, interaction, and exchange across vast distances and time frames. The evidence increasingly suggests that the Americas were never truly isolated from the rest of the world, Greyhawk observed. Human beings have been traversing oceans and maintaining long-distance connections for far longer than European colonial narratives have acknowledged. Recognizing this doesn't diminish indigenous identity. It places Native American histories within a more accurate global context of human exploration and adaptation. This reframing had profound implications not just for scientific understanding but for contemporary indigenous identity and sovereignty claims. Colonial legal frameworks had often defined indigenous status in terms of isolation and primitivity, assumptions that justified European claims to discovered territories. Recognizing the dynamic, connected nature of pre-colonial indigenous societies directly challenged these legal and political constructs. For Cherokee participants in the study, this recognition offered a way to reclaim the fullness and complexity of their history. We've always been told that our history began when Europeans discovered us, noted Richard Bushyhead, a Cherokee Nation citizen who participated in the research. Before that, we were supposedly isolated, unchanging, primitive. This research confirms what our oral traditions have always maintained, that we have a long, dynamic history of connection and adaptation that predates European arrival by thousands of years. As the research team prepared to publish their comprehensive findings in 2012, they faced a critical decision: how to present this complex, multifaceted evidence in a way that would be scientifically rigorous while respecting Cherokee sovereignty over their own historical and genetic narrative. The solution they arrived at was unprecedented in genetic anthropology. Rather than publishing primarily in academic journals, they worked with the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians to develop a community-controlled research repository, a physical and digital archive housed on tribal land and governed by Cherokee protocols for knowledge sharing and protection. This approach inverted the traditional power dynamics of scientific research on indigenous communities. Rather than extracting genetic material and knowledge from Cherokee people to produce academic papers primarily accessible to outside researchers, the team established a framework where the community maintained control over both biological samples and the knowledge derived from them. Academic publications would follow, but only with explicit tribal approval and involvement. The first such publication, Reconsidering Cherokee Origins, Genetic Evidence of Pre-Columbian Transatlantic Contact, appeared in the journal Nature in February 2013. Its list of authors was remarkable. Alongside Calloway, Greyhawk, and other academic researchers were the names of Cherokee community members who had contributed not just biological samples but crucial interpretive frameworks and traditional knowledge. The paper presented the team's genetic findings alongside linguistic, archaeological, and ethnographic evidence, situated within the context of Cherokee oral traditions. It was carefully framed not as a replacement for existing understandings of Native American origins, but as a complement that acknowledged greater complexity and dynamism in human migration patterns. The publication triggered immediate controversy. Some critics continued to question the methodology and interpretations. Others raised concerns about the political implications of the research. But many in the scientific community recognized the groundbreaking nature not just of the findings themselves but of the collaborative research model that had produced them. This work represents a new paradigm for genetic research with indigenous communities, wrote Dr. Sarah Tishkoff, a leading population geneticist not involved in the study, in an accompanying commentary. It demonstrates how scientific rigor and community sovereignty can reinforce rather than contradict each other, producing knowledge that is both more ethical and more complete than traditional research approaches allow. For the Cherokee participants, the publication marked a reclamation of narrative authority over their own history. For centuries, others have been telling us who we are and where we came from, noted Eastern Band Chief Michael Hicks at a ceremony marking the paper's release. This research represents Cherokee people speaking for ourselves, using both our traditional knowledge and the tools of modern science to tell a more complete story about our origins and journey as a people. This moment of reclamation was particularly significant given the Cherokee Nation's complex history of both resistance and adaptation to European colonization. In the early 19th century, the Cherokee had adopted aspects of European culture, including a written constitution, a bilingual newspaper, and formalized educational systems, while maintaining their distinct identity and sovereignty. This adaptive strategy failed to prevent their forced removal from ancestral lands during the Trail of Tears, 1838 to 1839, when thousands died during a brutal forced march to territories west of the Mississippi. The Eastern Band represented those who had managed to remain in their ancestral homeland in the Appalachian Mountains or return there after removal. Their continued existence as a distinct people, despite centuries of colonization, forced assimilation, and cultural suppression, testified to remarkable resilience and adaptability. The genetic research added a new dimension to this story of resilience, suggesting that the Cherokee capacity for cultural adaptation, while maintaining core identity, might reflect patterns established thousands of years earlier, when ancestors had integrated influences from across the Atlantic while maintaining their indigenous lifeways and knowledge systems. This perspective offered a powerful counter-narrative to colonial assumptions about indigenous purity and authenticity, assumptions that had often been weaponized against native nations by requiring them to prove continuous, unchanged cultural practices to maintain legal recognition and rights. Instead, it presented adaptation and integration as themselves authentic indigenous strategies, sophisticated responses to changing conditions that had enabled cultural survival through millennia of environmental and social transformations. For many Cherokee citizens, this reframing validated what their communities had always known, that maintaining identity through change was not a sign of cultural degradation but of cultural vitality. Our traditions teach us to take what is useful from new influences while holding firm to our core values and kinship systems, explained Rebecca Falling Leaf, a Cherokee language instructor who participated in the study. This research suggests our ancestors have been practicing this wisdom for thousands of years longer than we previously recognized. The findings also provided new context for understanding certain distinctive aspects of Cherokee culture that had long puzzled anthropologists, from unique astronomical knowledge to particular ceremonial practices that differed from those of neighboring indigenous nations. Rather than viewing these as anomalies or later adaptations, the research suggested they might reflect ancient cultural exchanges that had been integrated into Cherokee traditions millennia before European contact. Perhaps most significantly, the research offered a framework for understanding Cherokee identity that transcended the simplistic blood quantum measurements imposed by colonial authorities. Rather than defining Cherokeeness through fractional ancestry calculations, it presented a picture of Cherokee identity as emergent from complex historical processes of movement, interaction, adaptation, and continuity, processes that had biological dimensions but could not be reduced to genetics alone. What makes someone Cherokee is not a specific genetic profile, Greyhawk emphasized in presentations of the research. It's participation in Cherokee kinship systems, commitment to Cherokee values and responsibilities, and connection to Cherokee histories and futures. Our genetic findings simply offer a more complete picture of the historical journeys that have contributed to who we are as a people today. This nuanced perspective resonated deeply with many Cherokee citizens while challenging essentialist notions of indigenous identity that had been internalized by some community members through generations of colonial education. It invited a reconsideration not just of Cherokee history but of how that history is carried forward into contemporary identity formation and nation-building. As the research continued to develop, it sparked renewed interest in ancient Cherokee astronomical knowledge, particularly calendar systems and celestial observations that showed surprising similarities to Mediterranean traditions. Cherokee elders who maintained knowledge of these systems worked with archaeoastronomers to document alignments in ancient Cherokee sites that tracked celestial movements with remarkable precision. These investigations revealed that certain sacred sites in the Appalachian region had been constructed to align with specific astronomical events, solstices, equinoxes, and the movements of certain stars, in ways that paralleled megalithic structures in the Mediterranean world. While the architectural styles were distinct, the mathematical principles and observational knowledge embedded in these structures showed intriguing connections. These aren't crude or approximate alignments, noted Dr. Jameson Parker, an archaeoastronomer who joined the research team. They demonstrate sophisticated mathematical understanding and precise observational data accumulated over many generations. The parallels with certain Mediterranean astronomical traditions are too specific to be explained by coincidence or independent invention. Cherokee language specialists also identified terminological similarities in astronomical vocabulary, particularly in the names of certain star clusters and in the technical language used to describe celestial movements. These linguistic parallels correlated strongly with the distribution of the distinctive genetic markers, suggesting they might represent the preserved traces of ancient knowledge transmission across cultural contexts. What emerged from these multifaceted investigations was not a simple story of influence flowing from the Mediterranean to North America, but evidence of sophisticated knowledge exchange between distinct cultural traditions, an exchange that had enriched both societies while being fully integrated into indigenous knowledge systems. We need to move beyond colonial frameworks that always position indigenous knowledge as receiving and European knowledge as giving, Calloway emphasized. What we're seeing is evidence of meaningful exchange between sophisticated knowledge systems, each with their own strengths, insights, and methodologies. This perspective challenged persistent colonial hierarchies in how knowledge systems are valued and recognized. It suggested that indigenous astronomical traditions weren't primitive approximations of European science, but sophisticated systems with their own internal logic and empirical foundations, systems that had incorporated diverse influences while developing according to their own principles and purposes. For Cherokee community members, this recognition validated traditional knowledge that had been systematically devalued under colonization. Our grandparents and great-grandparents were punished in boarding schools for speaking our language and practicing our ways, noted Daniel Redbird, a Cherokee cultural preservationist. They were told that European ways of knowing were scientific and rational, while our knowledge was superstition and primitive belief. This research helps restore proper respect for the sophisticated intellectual traditions our ancestors developed and maintained. As the 10th anniversary of the initial genetic discovery approached in 2018, Calloway, Greyhawk, and their collaborators organized a major symposium bringing together scientists, indigenous knowledge keepers, and community members to reflect on what had been learned and what questions remained unexplored. The gathering, held on the Qualla boundary, represented an extraordinary convergence of knowledge systems, geneticists and traditional healers, linguists and story keepers, archaeologists and ceremonial leaders, each bringing their unique perspectives to a shared conversation about human history, identity, and belonging. 10 years ago, we detected an unexpected pattern in Cherokee DNA, Calloway reflected in his opening address. That discovery has led us on a journey far more profound than I could have imagined. Not just through genetic sequences, but through language, ceremony, star knowledge, plant medicine, and most importantly, through relationships of respect and reciprocity between scientists and communities. Eliza Greyhawk, who had become a respected elder in both scientific and Cherokee communities, offered her own reflection. This research has never been about replacing one origin story with another. It's been about recognizing that all human stories are more complex, more connected, and more beautiful than the simplified narratives we often tell ourselves. The Cherokee people, like all peoples, carry within us the journeys, adaptations, and wisdom of countless ancestors who navigated changing worlds with courage and creativity. What had begun as a scientific anomaly, unexpected genetic markers in Cherokee DNA, had evolved into something far more significant. A new model for how science could engage with indigenous communities, how multiple knowledge systems could inform each other, and how human identity emerges from the complex interplay of biology, culture, history, and self-determination. The discovery that some Cherokee ancestors likely crossed the Atlantic centuries before Columbus did not diminish their indigenous identity. It enhanced understanding of the dynamic, adaptive strategies that had enabled Cherokee people to maintain their distinct culture and knowledge systems through thousands of years of environmental change, population movement, and eventually colonial violence. This perspective offers profound implications not just for understanding Cherokee history, but for reconsidering human identity more broadly. In a world increasingly divided by rigid conceptions of cultural, national, and ethnic boundaries, the Cherokee genetic story reminds us that human history has always been characterized by movement, connection, and exchange, that purity is a colonial myth, while adaptation and integration represent authentic human strategies for survival and flourishing. Perhaps most importantly, this research demonstrates that scientific truth need not undermine cultural identity, that indigenous peoples can embrace the full complexity of their histories while maintaining their distinctive lifeways and knowledge systems. The ancient DNA carrying traces of Mediterranean ancestry doesn't make contemporary Cherokee people any less Cherokee. Rather, it testifies to the sophisticated ways their ancestors incorporated diverse influences while maintaining their core cultural continuity. In the double helix that spirals through generations of Cherokee bodies, we find written not just a sequence of nucleotides but a profound human truth. That identity emerges not from isolation but from relationship, not from purity but from the wisdom to incorporate difference while maintaining connection to land, community, and ancestral knowledge. The story encoded in Cherokee DNA is ultimately a profoundly human story, one that challenges us to recognize both our differences and our shared journey through time. In those microscopic molecules carrying ancient memories across centuries, we glimpse not just the hidden truth behind America's darkest DNA, but the luminous possibility of understanding ourselves as inheritors of all human journeys, connected through time to ancestors whose courage to cross oceans, adapt to new landscapes, and create meaning in changing worlds flows through our veins today, calling us toward a future where diversity is recognized not as division but as our greatest human strength.